Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jonas Lindström, the Managing Director of the Swedish-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce here in São Paulo. Para quem viu o convite em português, talvez assusta agora, mas realmente 90% desse evento vai ser feito em inglês, tá? Acho que a Ana Luísa, a doutora, vai falar em português, mas os outros dois palestrantes vão falar em inglês hoje. Espero que isso não assusta ninguém. So we're going to have a bilingual webinar today. I'm very happy to open this seminar, which will be moderated by Renato Pacheco, the coordinator of our Legal and Business Committee. And he is also the president of CAI, the arbitration chamber of Eurocâmaras, the European chambers here in São Paulo. And the consul of Sweden also here in São Paulo. He has many hats. So thank you so much, Renato, for organizing this webinar together with the Chamber. I will ask you to introduce the speakers we have today. And again, for those of you who are joining us, please turn off the microphones. We are recording the event, so we will, of course, also later promote the video, which will be on the Chamber's website. And welcome, of course, to our speakers, Kate, Ana Luisa, and Jim. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Please, Dr. Renato, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jonas, so much. It's our pleasure to be here back again to SWEDCHAM, starting the very first meeting the Legal and Business Committee actually is organized this year. So my big thanks to both Viviane and yourself, Jonas, for leadership and great opportunity to have foreign guest speakers from the United States, together with Ana Luisa, who is a colleague, a very reputed lawyer, mediator from southern state, Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre. And thanks to you, Ana Luisa, I could get this contact to both Kate and Jim, who are guest speakers today. And I will, without longer delays, introduce Ana. Ana Luisa, of course, as I meant before, she's a great colleague, a friend. She was introduced to me by Alejandro from the Spanish Chamber of Commerce. And she's, of course, certified by the Tennessee University, United States. She's been a mentor for a Canadian government. She's a very experienced lawyer and also a mediator in Brazil. And I brought the idea to the European Chamber to organize this event, how to, understand the new contractual framework in new modern era after pandemic, this new time everybody's facing. And then, of course, I said, that would be great, but I think it's important for us to also discuss the issue under a very international perspective. And that's why she kindly invited Kate and Jim, who also accepted the invitation. So, Ana, I will pass the floor to you. And then later, of course, I will also introduce and present Kate and Jim's bios. Go ahead, Ana, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Anna, you're on mute.
You are still mute.
Sorry. Is my screen sharing?
Yes. Yes.
Ok. Boa tarde a todos. Eu vou falar em português. Foi uma preparação que nós fizemos em respeito a várias pessoas que estão aqui que possivelmente tenham alguma dificuldade. Então, eu gostaria de, em primeiro lugar, agradecer à Câmara e ao Renato, particularmente, por aceitar a ideia de organização deste evento. Eu sou uma pessoa muito entusiasmada, Renato, e é aquela coisa assim, né, que gruda e não desgruda. Eu disse, Renato, vamos lá, porque este tema é um tema instigante e é a bola da vez, né? Como a gente gosta de usar na expressão aqui do futebol. Então, I'm sorry, Kate and Jim, but my introduction it's in Portuguese, but soon you'll see I'm trying to do in the both languages, okay?
Are you sharing already the screen? Are you seeing Ana Luisa's screen?
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
Começamos falando de contratos na nova economia, né? Mas não existe economia e não existe direito, aqui no que me diz respeito como advogada, e não existem os contratos sem a base social que lhes dá sustentação. I'm gonna be fast as I can. Mas nós temos uma base social distinta hoje, né? Nós somos almost 7.5 billion people. We have this revolution, essa revolução tecnológica, e we live more, né? We are living more. So, nós aqui ainda estamos influenciando, Renato, e se o Mick Jagger consegue continuar trabalhando e influenciando, por que nós não podemos, né? Então, eu gosto muito desse exemplo. Essa revolução silenciosa, eu estou com algum microfone aberto, que eu estou ouvindo um teclado aqui, eu não sei se alguém pode fechar o microfone. Ok? Obrigada. Essa revolução silenciosa, ela provocou uma série de modificação de valores na nossa sociedade, né? Então, a questão é tempo de um novo contrato social? Porque a pandemia e a revolução tecnológica nos trouxe, sim, a consciência de que as questões sociais, ambientais e econômicas, elas caminham juntas, e que um fato que ocorre no outro lado do planeta afeta todo o globo. Nós não tínhamos essa consciência até bem pouco tempo. O que significa isso? Significa que nós precisamos colaborar, porque se nós estamos interconectados nessas questões, que são questões vitais para todos nós, a colaboração, né, uma sociedade que colabora, já não é mais uma opção, é um valor necessário, né? E eu entendo aqui, modestamente, que chega a ser, para nós, advogados, um dever ético, o dever da colaboração. Bom, mas e o que acontece conosco aqui, que fazemos os contratos, né? Nós continuamos criando e elaborando os nossos contratos com estas dificuldades todas, né? Sempre trabalhando com a força, com exercício de poder, com uma linguagem, como eu digo, macarrônica e complexa, e criando, ao invés da convergência, a desconfiança e a divergência nas nossas relações. Pois bem, então surge ou ressurge no ambiente acadêmico a teoria relacional dos contratos, que foi trazida para esse universo nos anos 60, inicialmente por Ian McNeill, que trazia um olhar sociológico por sobre o contrato, né? O contrato visto sob um ponto de vista sociológico como parte recorrente, onipresente do comportamento humano, né? A troca, que é o que nós estamos fazendo aqui. E que Kate e Jim mostrarão para vocês de que maneira eles trabalharam hoje, atualizando a teoria dos contratos relacionais. Os contratos relacionais, para quem não sabe, são aqueles contratos que exigem termos e trocas variáveis. Eles têm uma relação, são aqueles que duram mais, têm uma relação mais contínua e duradoura, e, portanto, exigem um processo de negociação contínuo. Eles criam vínculos pessoais de solidariedade, confiança e cooperação, e eles geram interdependência no mais das vezes. Pois bem, então, o que acontece? Esses contratos, eles exigem os princípios fundamentais da transparência, da confiança, da equidade e da boa-fé. E vocês vão me dizer, bom, até aí, né, a pessoa que vai contratar, ela deve ser, né, a gente deve confiar, a gente deve trabalhar com boa-fé. Pois bem, não basta mais presumir, isso deve estar por escrito, né? Aquele antigo fio do bigode, que nós temos uma expressão, we have an expression here, a mustache, a promise, a mustache promise, I don't know how to translate, we have to write. Nós temos que escrever o bigode agora, né? Por quê? Porque Kate e Jim vão explicar para vocês que as nossas relações não são mais tão simplificadas como eram antigamente. Nós vivemos relações complexas. E por que eu estou aqui, né, advogada em Porto Alegre, o que eu estou fazendo aqui na Câmara Sueca, Renato? Pois bem, né, eu já vinha dizendo para o Renato, eu tinha uma grande insatisfação com os critérios impessoais das relações jurídicas. A ideia de unir, para mim, e quem me conhece, o Caio e a Ana estão aí, não me deixam mentir, sempre foi mais atraente do que a ideia do conflito, apesar de eu ser uma advogada de litígio durante grande parte da minha vida. Né? E a ideia do conflito e os reconhecidos custos do conflito, pessoais, sociais, psicológicos, econômicos, né? O meu estado de percepção com essa incoerência, né? Quando eu aproximava os clientes de uma forma convergente e o resultado final, que é o contrato, tinha uma linguagem completamente destrutiva e conflitiva, né? E, finalmente, essa sensação de que havia alguma coisa errada no jeito que eu ia, né? Essa dissonância né, desse comportamento jurídico todo com o novo modelo social e econômico. E essa forma tradicional que nós, advogados, temos de ver, né, o mundo jurídico. Quando é que eu comecei a trabalhar com isso? Né? Em outubro de 2019, me chegou às mãos, e eu estou escrevendo aqui, falando e lendo, porque é para ver depois, a Kate e o Jim não vão brigar comigo se eu cometi algum nonsense. Então, em outubro de 2019, eu já vinha trabalhando com uma outra metodologia que se chama contratos conscientes, conscious contracts, e eu estava ainda tateando, como a gente diz assim, né? Trabalhando, pisando em ovos, quando me chegou às mãos o artigo publicado pela Kate e os colegas na Harvard Business Review, intitulado A New Approach to Contracts. E eu, muito entusiasmada que sou, né? Quer dizer, eu li o artigo em outubro, em novembro um cliente me procura e eu resolvi aplicar a teoria, né, na prática. Transformei o cliente numa cobaia, né? Eu disse para ele, tu queres ser minha cobaia na reconstrução do teu relacionamento societário? Ele topou, não sei, né, se a coisa andou depois. Mas, desde então, eu tenho procurado me dedicar e aprofundar os estudos na aplicação dessas metodologias, né, especialmente, ultimamente, a metodologia VEST, da Kate, com quem eu tenho tido bastante interação. E eu trouxe aqui rapidamente, tentando ser super rápida, Renato, alguns exemplos de algumas manifestações de clientes na minha pequena amostragem, que nem de longe pode ser comparada à experiência que a Kate e o Jim têm. Então, assim, o meu background é startups, contratos de prestação de serviço, reestruturação societária, joint ventures, contrato de trabalho executivo, que é puramente relacional. Esse tem sido o meu material, que eu trabalhei, as experiências que eu tenho desde 2019 para cá. Eu fiz uma pequena enquete com os meus clientes, né? Vamos dizer assim, uma pesquisa de satisfação, serviço de atendimento ao consumidor, e vou compartilhar alguns exemplos de manifestações de clientes que construíram ou reconstruíram contratos relacionais aplicando estes novos conceitos. A identidade dos clientes está protegida pela confidencialidade, que é um dos elementos que eu utilizo em todo o processo, né? E a confidencialidade gera maior segurança para o compartilhamento das informações, na minha opinião, que são necessárias para o desenvolvimento do processo de construção da relação e do contrato. Sempre trabalhando aqui com a relação, e a minha amostragem são de pequenas empresas, em ambientes onde os atores são pessoas conhecidas, então a questão da preservação, né, da construção da relação, vai no mesmo sentido quando a gente está, Caio e Alexandre e Renata Moritz, na mediação, né, usando a confidencialidade no âmbito da resolução de conflitos. Pois bem, um dos exemplos aqui de Porto Alegre, da minha cidade, né, eu perguntei ao cliente como foi participar da construção de um contrato de uma forma não convencional. Eu não sei se ele está aí. A resposta foi a seguinte: 2 etapas. Primeiro, pelo fato de pensar e ter a responsabilidade direta do conteúdo a ser escrito e discutido amplamente com a outra parte integrante da relação. Isso exigiu tempo, dedicação e aprofundamento do entendimento do significado do contrato colaborativo. Segundo, posso dizer que houve lapidação do eu interior. Olha que profundo isso, gente, né? Porque realmente a pessoa assume para si a responsabilidade, né, de colaborar e de trabalhar no contrato, né? E nesta etapa, e pensar na proteção com reciprocidade. A Kate e o Jim falam muito em reciprocity, um dos princípios, e o cliente me trouxe isso, então foi genial ter recebido esse feedback. Nessa segunda etapa, foi possível identificar claramente meus valores e aplicá-los ao documento que servirá de guia ao propósito da sociedade. Como ficou o relacionamento societário após a conclusão do contrato? Na minha visão, o relacionamento com minha sócia era muito bom, mas este processo foi o caminho para deixar escrito tudo aquilo que vinha sendo pactuado verbalmente entre as partes envolvidas. Como eu disse, não basta o fio do bigode, tem que escrever, né? E agora com a visual law, né, Renato? Né, aquela brincadeira, entendeu o que é que eu desenhe? Né? Está mais em pauta e possível. E essa resposta aqui eu gosto muito. Você pensa que o resultado atendeu suas expectativas? Sim, perfeitamente. O documento elaborado possui a alma das partes envolvidas. The soul of the parties involved. I love this answer. E certamente as mesmas nunca poderão dizer que não leram ou não interpretaram o documento corretamente. Esse é um aspecto que eu tenho trabalhado muito, que é o tema de como é que as partes querem que o contrato seja interpretado. E isso parte de uma série de princípios fundamentais que a Kate e o Jim brilhantemente vão explicar para vocês. Eu só estou fazendo aqui a corrida da apresentação. Finalmente, eu tenho aqui um exemplo aí de São Paulo, que foi um contrato de terceirização de serviço de administração. A cliente me deu esse feedback. Acredito que o nosso relacionamento só ganhou com tudo, inclusive com os desconfortos provocados pelo processo, porque, claro, existem desconfortos, a coisa não é linear, nós estamos falando em relacionamento. Né? Então, desconfortos para quem não gosta, o Jonas, que já mora aqui em São Paulo, deve já ter ouvido a expressão DR, né? Fazer uma DR. Nos Estados Unidos, é dizer, we have to talk. We have to talk in the beginning, in the middle, or in the end of the relationship, but we have to talk. So, nós temos que fazer uma DR. De preferência, fazemos a DR antes, para não dar problema. Então, a cliente admitiu os desconfortos provocados pelo processo, mas diz que ganhou mais intimidade para tratar de assuntos mais delicados com respeito e tranquilidade. Nos conhecemos melhor um ao outro. Foi uma oportunidade muito especial para a parceria. Acredito que ainda seja precoce mensurar todos os ganhos, sinto que ainda há potencial emergindo de tudo isso que vivemos. Atualmente, o escritório está trabalhando, acabou de fechar uma joint venture, onde nós fizemos a medição de compatibilidade das empresas. As empresas experimentaram o relacionamento durante 6 meses. No final desses 6 meses, chegaram à conclusão de que os sistemas das empresas e, sobretudo, os valores de ambas as organizações não eram compatíveis. Então, nós trabalhamos um distrato assistido que foi recentemente concluído, né? Deve ser assinado esta semana. E, atualmente, estamos acompanhando a reconstrução de uma estrutura societária de prestação de serviços que está com uma demanda, aumentou muito a demanda e eles querem terceirizar. E aí nós estamos refazendo a relação interna para que depois haja coerência no processo de terceirização. Corri o que eu pude aqui, Renato. A Kate e o Jim são determinados e muito preparados para tratar o tema com uma inteligência acima da média, além de estarem lastreados em potente trabalho de pesquisa e estudos de caso. Tem sido um grande aprendizado estar em contato com ambos e com a sensibilidade, experiência e pragmatismo na construção de relações que são mais apropriadas à nossa realidade social e econômica. É um grande prazer poder compartilhar este evento com ambos, e especialmente conduzido pelo Renato, a quem eu já considero um amigo, e agradeço ao Alejandro, da Câmara Espanhola, que me apresentou, e deixo aqui os meus contatos, agradeço a oportunidade, parabenizo mais uma vez o trabalho da Kate e do Jim e devolvo a palavra ao Renato. Não sei quanto tempo eu levei, mas eu fiz o meu esforço aqui, Renato.
Anna, thank you so much. It was a very great presentation. You met the proposed time frame we spoke about before. And now, dear friends, we have the opportunity to welcome our first international keynote speaker, Kate Witasek. I will introduce her. She has kindly accepted the invitation from SWEDCHAM and the European Chamber to be with us here today. Kate is a very well-known international researcher. She has been very famous for the method she developed herself called the vested business model method. And she has been writing many books, 7 books, and of course, she has been awarded many times. And Kate, it's a pleasure for us to have you here today with us. I give you the floor for your presentation, and I will keep questions for a later moment after your presentation, Jim's presentation as well. Thank you so much, Kate. The floor is yours.
So Renato, if you could go ahead and introduce Jim as well, because I think Jim and I are going to kind of interweave our conversation in our chat today. So I'd want to definitely don't want to bury Jim. And so let's lift him up, and if you could do your intro of Jim too, that would be awesome.
That is my pleasure, Kate. And Jim Bergman, well, the name could be very Swedish, of course. We chatted before, but of course, a German origin. And well, Jim has been a fantastic legal professional. He has been a lawyer for many years, worked for big corporations in the petrochemical sector. He was, of course, among the Fortune 500 list, Amco Corporation, and he's been dealing with this issues like how can contracts better perform the functions they should have, not only for one party, but for both parties. And Jim, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us, sharing your experience with Kate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renato.
Excellent. So Jim and I wanted to integrate. I'm kind of from the business perspective, right? So I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee, which is renowned for our work in supply chain management, ranked between #1 and #5 around the world, depending on the ranking. And Jim comes from a legal background, and I love your format here, where you're really thinking about business and legal together. And that's why we wanted to not just have, oh, here's Kate talking about business and here's Jim talking about the legal side, but we wanted to integrate it, because the more we can integrate the legal side and the business side, I think you can really change the way people think and the lens of how they do contracts. So let's go ahead and jump in. Today's topic is really the highlights of our book, Contracting in the New Economy, using relational contracts to boost trust and collaboration in strategic business relationships. And if you think about why, what's the why behind a relational contract? I think Anna talked a little bit about this, but the world is changing, right? So the economy and the business world that we live in is more global and outsourced than ever. Organizations are seeking to be lean and agile and flexible, yet at the same time try to manage risk. The pandemic taught us that. We have risk. Now we have all the inflation happening. And so we need to manage risk and create value. And more than ever, we're in a networked economy. So how do I think about my suppliers as a way to be flexible and creating value and helping me manage risk, versus sitting across the table and I'm just trying to get a widget for a price? And so our topic today really is a little bit about the research and theory, and I'm going to share that. So I'll wear my professor hat, talking about the why. And then Jim's going to talk about how to put the theory into practice. And I'm going to, after he does that, I'm going to share a short case study. And then Jim will tag back in with a legal perspective, being wearing his lawyer hat. So let's first look at the theory. So I want to point out a Nobel Prize winning economist by the name of Oliver Williamson. He's very famous for his work in transaction cost economics. And transaction cost economics is basically, the cost. He looks at the friction between these business relationships. And anytime there's friction, then it's going to create a drag or a transaction cost economics. So the goal of what Oliver teaches in his work on transaction cost economics is to create buyer-supplier relationships that have as least friction as possible. And in his work, what he's famous for is this concept of promoting a hybrid approach. So he says, we can look here and use the market. So we can have a buy-sell relationship. We can do competitive bids, or we can we can create what he calls the corporate hierarchy. And most businesses think about their supplier relationships from a strategic make or buy. And if we choose to buy, we use the market. And what Oliver talks about is that there's a whole playground in the middle, something he calls a hybrid. So our work in supply chain at the University of Tennessee takes this theory, this Nobel Prize winning theory of having a hybrid relationship, and looks at how organizations are working with their suppliers to bring this to life. And what we find, if you map, Oliver's continuum to the business practices, most organizations are down here on the left-hand side of our continuum. So they have basic or approved suppliers. They may have a strategic supplier, but it would be more of a preferred supplier. So they're saying strategic relationships and partnerships, but they still do things very transactionally, buying things per hour, per widget, per mile, per shipment, per call, whatever that is. So while we say strategic partner, we really still anchor our contracts in a buy-sell transactional way. And what you've seen over the course of the last 15, 20 years is an emergence of more strategic relationships, performance-based contracts, or managed services contracts. And what we found in our research is the concept that we've coined vested, an outcome-based business model. So not having just transactions, but an outcome. And then of course here, if something is so strategic, then you would just do it yourself. You'd fall into that make category. So this concept in this middle, right, really relies on relationships, because the more dependent we are, the more risky we are as we work with our suppliers. We need to be more transparent and think about collaborating to de-risk these relationships. So as organizations shift up the sourcing continuum, in essence, they're doing so to create more value and to be more flexible. But on the flip side, it makes these relationships more dependent. And then you think, well, I don't want all my eggs in one basket with a supplier. How do I balance this yin and the yang, right? To address complexity and collaboration with this thought of dependency. And this is where the concept of trust and transparency come in. And we have to address the relationship and the power of the relationship in helping us de-risk, putting our eggs in one basket or in a couple baskets with suppliers. So here's the problem, right? The world has changed, but the way we write contracts hasn't. If you pick up a contract today, it looks and feels similar to contracts that were written in a traditional buy-sell philosophy, right? And so we're not embracing the flexibility, the relationship components. And the pandemic has actually highlighted the commercial weaknesses from not having strategic collaborative relationships. So organizations need to rethink not only how they strategically source in the new economy, but also how those contracts align. And we had written a book called Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy that's been quite well endorsed. It's actually taught around in about 40 universities around the world. And as we were helping organizations understand the procurement aspect, more and more we'd hear people say, well, the lawyers, they just, they don't get where the business pressures that were coming in, and we have to embrace this. And that creates what we've coined the contracting paradox. This is actually a real picture. I've squished the little guy down, but he's about 6 feet tall. He looks short in this picture. But look, this is a contract from the Department of Defense. And so this contract, if he's 6 feet tall, this contract's got to be about 10 feet. So here's the contracting paradox. We write contracts to make plans, and we want to make sure that we can de-risk as much as we can. But our brains actually trick ourselves into believing that we can write the perfect contract. If I just add more words, if I just shift the risk to the supplier, I'm going to be protected more. But it's never been so important that we embrace our suppliers as partners and have transparency. So shifting risk actually sometimes backfires because we put we bury our head in the sand, and that risk was shifted. But is the supplier doing a good job of managing that risk? And actually, if we pull back and we have transparency and collaboration, and we work we bring forward the relationship in these strategic deals, and not just the deal points, not just the scope and the money and the metrics, but we bring front and center the relationship, we can actually reduce the risk of some of these partnerships. So we would actually argue that a different lens is needed. Organizations need to harness the power of strategic alliances. They need to understand that the suppliers have core competencies. And so rather than buy and sell and try to get the best deal, what's the best price? What if we took a step back and we transparently looked at all of the cost, and we put in governance and different mechanisms to help us work together? Could we actually reduce our cost structure through collaboration? Could we reduce risk through collaboration? And that's what we find in our research. The organizations that are leaning into these partnerships, but not just leaning in, in a way that just says strategic partnership, they're actually defining what that strategic partnership means in the contract itself. So they're bringing forward the softer relational constructs into the business. A lot of times people say, well, here's the relationship and here's the contract. And if we have a great relationship, we can just put the contract in the drawer. And what we would argue is the contract needs to align to the relationship, because when it doesn't, it actually poses risk. So there's this continuum. If we think about it, you've got the desire to have a complete contract, right? Where you write everything down and you want it to, be written in stone. And if something goes wrong, you can point to that contract. But then on the other side, you've got this handshake agreement. You've got the relationship. And we know through research, not just the University of Tennessee's research, but lots of research by lots of leading academics, including Nobel Prize winning academics, that the softer stuff can create a lot of value in these relationships. So how do I balance this need between having a formal contract and having a great relationship? And what we proposed in our Harvard Business Review article, and one of our co-authors is actually Oliver Hart, a Nobel Prize winning economist for his work in contract theory. So one of the things we proposed was this idea of a formal relational contract. We want to not only have the formal contract, but we want, and not just have the relationship, but we want to integrate the relational constructs into the contract. So we define a formal relational contract as a legally enforceable written contract. It is still a contract, but it establishes the concept of the commercial partnership, the relationship embedded into the contract. So we're going to pull in the relational contracts, those social norms, our joint objectives, our governance structures, and we're going to create a flexible contract framework. I like to say business happens. And so when business happens, we need to go back and have mechanisms that allow us to change the contract in a fair and flexible way. So we can't just say, well, this is what the contract says. If business happened, we have to rely on social norms and guiding principles to realign the contract. And what that's going to do in a more dynamic world that we live in, it's going to help us have continual alignment of interest. So we're pulling in and embracing the relational constructs, guiding principles, as well as the governance structures into our formal contract. So it is something in the middle. So it's not either or, it is a flexible framework designed to create, in the words of Stuart Macaulay, a very famous legal scholar, instruments for social cooperation and to keep the parties in continuous alignment of interest. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. Why don't you talk about how you put this continuum into practice? And so here's the theory, but how does it really work?
And when we do put it into practice, in many instances, it's already had at least an initial draft, if you will. And these 5 items that are listed on the screen, we're going to go into each of these 5. For instance, Kate, the first one being focus. How do we put it into real practice? Well, basically, we have to shift ourselves away from either end of the spectrum. We've got to find ways not to just make it purely a transaction, like that soldier that's got the 10-foot contract next to him, or a handshake. It has to be a blend. And so the focus is going to be on both the contractual terms and conditions, but also the relationship elements, and blending those together, creating an additional structure. A way that we put it into practice, and that we've seen others across the globe, we create in many of our contracts scopes of work, service level agreements, in which usually the customer tells the supplier what's expected. But in a relational mode, there are certain elements such as shared vision, guiding principles, guiding overall objectives between the parties, and those come into play. So beyond the focus, Kate, the relationship, we look at it taking more than just a distant arm length relationship and it's not yet going to be into a partnership. It's going to be in between. And we find that in many instances, when we talk about relationship, we're talking about company A and company B, but it's really somewhat misplaced with the focus when we isolate it just as company A and company B. What we see is individuals within company A who are going to be embracing the relational approach, and individuals in company B who are embracing those same relational approaches. Those are the ones that come together and create that genesis of the relationship. Those individuals create the inspiration. They create the precedent from which hopefully others will then learn and build upon. So it's not as if the entire corporation A and corporation B come into a relationship that's blended somewhere in between an arm's length and a partnership. It eventually, gets more and more in that direction, but initially it's going to be a cadre of individuals who come forward. We also look at risk management and, what are we going to do in terms of risk? We, the two parties that are part of this overall relational approach, what are we going to do when we address risk? Are we going to basically try to allocate risk to each other and stand away from that risk and force the other party? Or do we take a different filter, different perspective and say, the risk, it's not your risk, nor is it my risk, it's our risk. Both of us, both parties need to deal with this risk, need to find ways to mutually manage the risk, maybe even eliminate that risk, perhaps mitigate it. And so the little diagram on the left side around power and putting contractual arrangements and obligations upon the other party, it's as foolish as an individual sitting in a sinking boat who's sitting there saying, I'm sure glad the hole isn't on our end, and that the other party in this boat that we're in or this relationship, they're the ones who need to bail us out of this situation. No, it's all of us within that boat who have that hole in the bottom of our boat. We need to find ways of aligning ourselves, much like the picture on the right-hand side, where we're working, we're rowing, we're heading in the same direction together, collaborating and working in an orchestrated fashion to address risk in a joint approach rather than an us versus them approach. When we look at social norms, we ask ourselves, well, are social norms going to have a role and a place in our contract and in our relational approach? And at one end of the spectrum, some would say, well, we don't need to worry about those social norms. As the common adage says on the screen, nothing's personal, it's just business. And that cold, distant, non-emotional approach, well, that might serve some organizations and some transactional approaches. Well, it doesn't have a place in the relational approach. McDonald's at the other end of the spectrum says, hey, we are going to use trust, we're going to use our relationship to such an extent that we're not going to rely on written terms and conditions. That in many of the contracts that McDonald's uses with its strategic high-end suppliers, they don't really pursue having a contract in place because they know that the relationship is so strong, and it's the relationship that's going to help them generate value, that's going to help them mitigate and manage risk, that's going to help them innovate, build trust. Contracts don't build trust, it's the relationship, and that's where McDonald's focuses on, is building trust with its supply base, so that when there are problems and risks that emerge, they, McDonald's and their suppliers, can work together to mitigate and manage. And so we find in many of these instances, there is a blend where there is both some formality of a written document, but there's very heavy weave of relationship and relationship attributes, characteristics into that contract. And then the fifth around planning. In the relational approach on the far right, we look for a fair and a balanced, flexible framework, somewhat of that agile mentality. Whereas on the left-hand side, there might be a highly structured, high-level governance, a rigidity that exists between the parties that allows one to try to strive for complete planning. And Kate mentioned the contracting paradox of, we want contracts so that we can plan, but we can never really fully plan. So why have contracts? And it ends up becoming a little frustrating. Well, with the formal relational contract, the blend in the middle allows us as contracting practitioners to try to bring some of that flexibility, yet rigidity, into the planning process. As Oliver Williamson has indicated in his seminal research, all contracts are incomplete, especially when they're complex. Even some more simple contracts are incomplete. And so how do we basically fill in those holes? Do we fill in those holes with some random approach, or do we fill those holes in with some structure, with some given ways of approaching those holes and those gaps in the contracts? And that's where relational contracting addresses these solutions to otherwise very daunting challenges. So Kate, those are those 5 focal points. Did you want to cover these 5 steps?
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do is so not just what's the difference between a formal relational contract and a traditional transactional contract, but how to get there. And we've got lots of case studies. We actually profiled 2 case studies in the Harvard Business Review article, several in the book, Getting to We. But in the book, Contracting the Economy, we wanted to take that and drill it down and put in a lot of teaching and best practices and kind of tools that people can use to help them create formal relational contracts. So there are 5 steps that we teach. The first step being lay the foundation, the second being create a shared vision, the third adopting formal guiding principles into the contract. Then and only then do we kind of negotiate the actual constructs, the scope, the metrics, and money. And then lastly, staying aligned. So let's look at what a case study. This case study we actually profile in the book, Contracting in the New Economy, and this comes from Island Health and their doctors. So Island Health is a health authority in the Canadian government. They're in the Vancouver, British Columbia area of the Canadian government, and they have doctors. And you can see this was the headlines that they had in 2014 and 2015. Very contentious relationship. It was a union contract, going back and forth with a union contract, not a healthy relationship at all. And actually their contract was at a standstill. So they were out of contract, outside of a contract for 3 years. They could not get to an agreement, but the doctors still had to come to work. And so very, very frustrating. This is actually a list of the adjectives. So we asked them at the beginning of the working on their relational contract, what did they feel about the relationship? Strained, distrustful, broken, suspicious, adversarial, dysfunctional, untrusting. And so you bring in the methodology, step 1 is laying the foundation. So a team of both the Island Health administrators and the doctors came together, and we put right front and center trust, the lack of trust, transparency, the lack of transparency, compatibility. How is their working relationship? Why didn't they like each other? So you actually have this kind of an offsite, a strategic offset, putting that elephant in the room and talking about it. And what you find is that it's not the other person, but you've created this system that or a lack of a system that doesn't enable you to bring and put that relationship front and center. And so after they talk about why they're not trusting, why they're not transparent, and they agree that being trusting and transparent is important, the parties then create a shared vision and objectives. This is the actual shared vision from their contract. So together we are as a team that celebrates and advances excellence in the care of our patients, right? And so they're formalizing where they want to go. So they're coming together, co-creating. So this shared vision is front and center in their contract, and I'll show you that in a second. So the third thing that they do is agree on guiding principles. So when I like to say, when business happens and you have to make a decision, you will go back to your shared vision and guiding principles. Things like reciprocity, autonomy, honesty, loyalty, equity, and integrity. And you can see they have written words about how they will apply these guiding principles when they make decisions. Now, the fourth step is, once you've got those first three, we call those first three things the statement of intent. It's a commitment to the relationship. It's a commitment to your shared vision and guiding principles. Then and only then do you begin to work on the actual contract terms and conditions. And here, instead of sitting across the table and negotiating, you're sitting together co-creating. We actually have a class called collaborative contracting, where we take clauses and we have people rethink the clauses in light of the guiding principles. So Glenn Gallants was an attorney for the hospitalists. He says this co-creation aspect, instead of negotiating, we're collaborating. What should our termination clause look like that best supports the business? What should our pricing model look like that best supports the business? And the real power of the methodology is taking these philosophies, these win-win philosophies, the relational philosophies, and driving them down into the actual contract clauses. So we're not pitting ourselves against each other to shift risk, but how do we best manage the risk? Now, the fifth step is around the governance and staying in alignment. So here you'll find a lot of words in the contract. What is the governance structure? What's the tier of governance? How do we make decisions? What is our cadence? How do we onboard new team members? And so you're coming up with the mechanisms of how you manage the relationship in the business, and those are formally embedded into the contract. So your contract isn't just scope, schedule, or scope and metrics and money, but it's the relational constructs. So as you integrate these concepts, these relational concepts into the contract, this is the first 3 pages of the Island Health hospitalist contract. And I know it's really small. It's not meant for you to read the detail, but I want to just talk you through the logic. Right up front, they have your shared vision. So right here at the bottom of page 1, it says, Island Health and the hospitals agree to abide by shared vision, guiding principles, and intended behaviors. So top of page 2 is their shared vision. Then right under that is the guiding principles. And then following that is their intended behaviors, the culture that they want to create. They want a culture of being forward focused, of being patient centered. So they're agreeing on the intent of the relationship, and that is front and center, anchoring the contract. And so if you track these relational contracts over time, you can see the power that they have through purposely working together to collaborate and create a trusting, transparent environment. From May 2016, negative 85% adjectives of how the parties felt about the relationship. 2 years later, 86% positive. And then just last year, 89% positive. So they're able to not only turn that around, but maintain these healthy relationships. And so you go from these negative environments to a positive environment. Here, as pandemic persists, they're innovating, rolling out a hospital at home program. They're able to deal with, business happening in a fair and balanced way. And it doesn't just work in bad relationships. It works in good relationships that you can make great. It works in all kinds of relationships. And that's what we do in our research, is we study these types of deals. For example, Boeing Australia, with the indigenous suppliers, wrote the first agreement of its kind in Boeing, and how they're working to build partnerships with the indigenous community. Johnson & Johnson have been noted for winning awards for their partnership with Sodexo, and the Australian Navy embedding relational contracts and having success with them in their weapon systems. So Jim, I want to hand it over to you to wrap us up and put a kind of a legal perspective. So, we always ask, are these legal contracts? Can you actually do these? So what do you think?
And with this, make it very brief. There's 2 questions or points that are just so important here. And one is, are they enforceable? And second off, what is a relational contract? Well, the first question of are they enforceable? In civil jurisdictions tends to be much more convincingly, yes, they're enforceable. But in common law jurisdictions up until recently, there was a lot of doubt. But in 2 or 3 years ago, there was a case that came out known as the Bates case, in which Alan Bates and others were these franchisees across the UK postal system. And in that particular scenario, the elements of the contract that was in place between Mr. Bates and others vis-a-vis the postal system was brought to the court. And in that particular instance, and Kate, if you want to move that slide up, Justice Frazier, Peter Frazier, gave many of us the greatest gift of all in that he laid out that there is enforceability around relational contracts, and he gave us a definition of what he at least saw and his peers on the court saw as relational contracts. And so it pivoted on good faith, that there needed to be some good faith between the parties. And so much of the reality around putting together a relational contract underscores how good faith is being relied upon, from the shared vision and shared objectives to the guiding principles. That good faith element permeates throughout those documents. And so as Justice Frazier said, when both parties must refrain from conduct which is going to be regarded as unacceptable and be viewed that way by reasonable and honest people, then we have good faith. If transparency, cooperation, trust, confidence are in place, either implicitly or explicitly, then we have good faith. And so, Kate, if the next slide, we then see his discussion in that opinion start to lay out 9 elements or characteristics of what he and his peers on the court saw as being needed, indicators that would trigger, yes, there is good faith, and yes, there's relational. And again, many of these points you would argue in civil jurisdictions tends to already be there, but at least on the common law jurisdictions, one, there must be no specific express terms that prevents the duty of good faith from being implied. As you can see, the other 4 bullet points on that screen, that they're long-term in nature, that they intend their respective roles to be performed with integrity, with fidelity to the bargain, that they are committed to collaboration, which then leads to innovation, that the spirit and objective of the approach is going to be capable of being expressed. And Kate, the last slide with the 4 others, we'll then look to trust and confidence, that the contract has a high level of communication between the parties, cooperation, a fostering of mutual trust, that there's going to be some investment, not necessarily always a pure financial investment, but perhaps an investment of human resource, of energy, of talent, of approach, pursuing the contract in the relationship. And in some instances, if there is an element around exclusivity, but it wasn't as strong of a characteristic, but if there's exclusivity, that also helps tip the scales. So most of those 9 points that Justice Frazier laid out gives us at least a better picture of what the courts would deem as relational. And as we sculpt and create our relational contracts as attorneys, if we use that at least as some guidance, it certainly will help us and have confidence that what we're putting together, in fact, would be enforceable. So Kate, I am going to let you do any wrap-up comments, because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Before Kate does any wrap-up, I want to thank you all for allowing us this opportunity to give this awareness around relational. So Kate, I'm going to let you do any wrap-up.
Right, and I'm going to turn it back over to Anna to facilitate any questions that we have and kind of wrap us up.
Thank you, and congratulations you both. I just want to share a thought, because we have mediators here and we have lawyers, and it's important, in my opinion, to emphasize, if I may, that a contract prepared with the antecedent preparation of the relationships is a contract that is more likely to be resolved by mediation. Ou seja, aqueles contratos onde as partes se dispõem a trabalhar e a se comprometer com princípios de colaboração, de confiança, de boa-fé, sem dúvida, né? E eles não só trabalham, eles escrevem e assinam embaixo esse compromisso, ele tem muito mais chance de ser encaminhado para uma resolução através do consenso ou da autocomposição. Era só isso que eu queria complementar depois dessa brilhante explanação dos queridos Kate e Jim.
So, comment to that question. Now, my Portuguese is really rusty, so I'm not quite sure of exactly what you asked, but I do want to offer this. Would, on a relational contract, would it be more likely to be resolved by mediation? My knee-jerk reaction is no. And the reason I say no is that in relational, there's fewer disputes. And when there are disputes, the disputes are resolved between the two parties. And so the need to go outside the relationship to an arbitrator, a mediator, a mini trial, or some other alternate dispute resolution forum or full litigation, those instances go down significantly. And so on the face of that question, I would say no, it's less likely they will be resolved by mediation.
But yes, one of the things that we do see is that organizations, when they're stuck, they actually bring in a neutral. It might be a mediator, it might just be a business person to help them get unstuck. So they're proactively saying, I don't want to have a conflict. How do I work through these? And that's where the formal governance structures and the escalation and the joint risk registers are all teaching the organizations how to work through and prevent conflict by staying in alignment.
And with that neutral, they bring in many times a standing neutral who is involved through much of the life cycle of the project, of the relationship. And that standing neutral, again, helps prevent the disputes from getting very large to the point where they're challenging to somehow resolve.
Well, I have a question also to both of you, Kate and Jim, but of course, only after congratulating you both on the excellent and outstanding presentations you both brought us in a very integrated way. Business model, as Kate well described it, and Jim, you took the legal approach as a very experienced lawyer and corporate advisor. I mean, of course, at Swedchem, we have very strong international companies. They might have been set up or found in Sweden, but they became, of course, major world players. They became global players. And of course, nowadays we have different kinds of countries. We have countries among or between big corporations, but we also have the SMEs, which are more and more popping up. I think, Kate, you well cited startups, and Sweden's very famous for having a lot of startups. I'm sure that Eunice has, along within the membership, many companies who became strong companies, but they started very small in the garage. And of course, a question I have to both of you is, when you have different levels of structure and complexity, you have like an individual on the one side, a funding company on the other side, or an SME or a multinational corporation. How, Kate and Jim, you think is ideal for us to balance the countries? Because of course, we live in a world of sharing economy, Uberization, as we call here in Brazil. Everybody's sharing everything. And I think you put very well the accent on bringing people together, not putting people against each other, right? The countries have as a main purpose to unite people, not to separate people, not to challenge each other. But of course, it has to do a lot of the culture, right? I mean, if you are having a country among, let's say, or between American companies, one thing, if you put an American company, a Swedish company, things may differ a bit. So it's more like, just out of my curiosity, what is your view on this kind of imbalanced relation? Is it possible to have a relational contract? Is it possible to have a collaborative approach when you have so different parties, different cultural background, and different corporate structures? That would be the question to both Kate and Jim, please.
That's why we would actually say it's more important, right? Because then you get alignment. So in the process that we teach, it's a step-by-step methodology. And so you go through and we teach design principles. And so you're learning the design principle and then together writing the rules of your agreement. So your contract isn't just this legal thing that you redline. It's actually, you have a concept. We need to have some kind of a way to terminate. What's the most appropriate way for our business? We need to have a way to think about the work. What's the most appropriate way to do that? Instead of using the traditional transactional way, you're using the best fit way and you're co-creating that using design principles. Now, I will tell you, you mentioned Sweden, and I want to highlight this. The Nordics has actually been the area where we have seen the most traction in formal relational contracts. We actually did a white paper about 2 years ago studying 20 formal relational contracts and the success that they have had. And I think because the Nordics have a high trust factor, they are actually really some of the world's leaders in saying, you know, we need to think about this differently. And some of those deals that they have aren't just within the Nordics, right? They're pan-European or global deals. So the Nordics actually, I think, is a role model for embracing these concepts. And you're absolutely right. When you have this difference, the bigger your difference, the bigger the risk, the more complex, that's when you need formal relational contracts. You need to come together to co-create the rules that are fair and balanced using the guiding principles.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you,
I would
Kate.
add in that with the formal relational contract, you have those shared vision, shared objectives, those guiding principles delineated within the document. And so many more people can read those and look at those and say, yes, I buy into that. And it then brings them in with much greater effect, rather than, it seems like many times contracts will alienate and repel people. These sort of draw and bring on a magnetic effect people into the relationship and the contract that's governing it.
Thank you, Jim.
It's an alive contract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you remember in the definition, it focuses on continual alignment of interest. Business happens. How do we have to go back and readjust our contract, given our guiding principles, given the governance structure that we had? So we're teaching people how to stay in continual alignment, not just write the legal terms and conditions and the scope and the metrics and the price.
Advogados presentes.
Encompassing it, right?
Kate, we had a situation here in Brazil in the 80s, 90s, and I'm not sure, that we had an explosion of revisional litigation. Esqueçam as ações de revisão de contrato, pessoal. Os advogados presentes aqui, lembra, Caio e Alexandre? Aquela explosão nos final dos anos 80, início dos 90, creio que quando explodiu o Código de Defesa do Consumidor, né, começaram a surgir uma quantidade explosiva de ações de revisão de contrato. Né? Isso, esse contingente de litígio poderia ser evitado em alguns casos, né? Me atrevo a dizer.
Maybe just another remark from my side, because Eunice has been leading the chamber over a decade, and of course he could experience different people in different positions, sometimes in the same companies, right? He entered the chamber, we had some CEOs sitting, there on the chair, then they changed, they were replaced. And sometimes contracts go much longer than CEOs may keep the chair, because they are being replaced, they pass away, they change the company. And many long-term complex contracts, they have, of course, to force this transition. So that's, I think, the challenge you have when you are having a legal entity, especially those working on multinational level, multicultural level. The contract is not done because I'm having here the pen to sign or to perform whatever the scope can be, but I have to see in the long run that the companies, either as a provider, as a supplier, as a client, they have to keep together. And this, I think, Jim, you put very well, regardless of the people and regardless of the legal structure. The legal structure is there to serve, and to support the business, right, Kate? That's, I think, the very good point I think you mentioned. Without, I mean, this willingness to be together, you cannot just create synergy by a legal paragraph. That's not possible. We have to see the people behind and not only focus on the contract. I think that's a very important approach for us here in the legal committee. It's not by chance, Eunice, that we have a legal and business committee, right? We have both names on the title because one cannot go without the other. They go together. So I think that's a very important thing. I'm looking at the clock here. I know we have many participants on it. Do you like to have one more question or two from our guests? Just to...
Está aberto, não sei se algum dos colegas ou alguém da assistência quer fazer, pode ser algum comentário adicional. Eu vou puxar aqui os meus conhecidos, né? Quem mandou estar com a câmera aberta, Alexandre, Caio, né? Obrigada, graças, Ana Ernesto, por tua presença. A Renata Moritz, que também está por aqui. Não sei se vocês têm algum comentário, alguma questão, por favor.
Well, sometimes, Ana Luisa, we were asked as lawyers to produce B2B agreements, B2B contracts. But I'm used to say that behind every word or letter you put in a contract, there is the age of human. So I know that artificial intelligence is growing and many things we'll be doing by this kind of smart contracts. But I believe that we humans are still the difference. And I'm an old school guy. I know that the contracts must reflect the intention of the parties. So I dedicate my time to talk the more I can when I'm drafting the agreement. While we're drafting, talking with my client, talk with the other lawyers to produce something that's not a commented draft or a reviewed draft, but it's really the closest we can to the intention of the parties.
Yeah, and Alejandro, I want to go back to that continuum slide from Oliver Williamson. And I think smart contracts are actually going to be a great thing for the lower end of the continuum, the simple, more basic type contracts that we can automate. But the more complex contracts, as you mentioned, need human interaction. That's not going to go away. We solve problems together, not just in a smart contract. And so I think you're going to start to see smart contracts apply and rise up for the lower end of the simpler contracts and relational contracts being embraced for the more strategic ones. Instead of everyone kind of doing a regular basic transactional contract for our suppliers, you'll start to see this dichotomy.
And even though they're going to be smart contracts, they're still going to be incomplete contracts. And this is where relational characteristics are going to be so essential to be brought into creating that framework.
And maybe, Jim, because they are incomplete, that's why people are more than necessary, right? To complete the lackness of the legal area. Eunice will agree with me. We have on the board of Swedchem, one of his colleagues is a company from Sweden called Lexley. She's not here today, right? Juliana.
I know those guys. They actually
you know them.
Yeah, so they've been chatting with me about how to bring relational contracts to some of their sustainability stuff. Interesting.
That's great to know, Kate, because actually, I mean, Juliana is a very active board member of Swedchem. And of course, what they're trying to do is a Swedish-based company from the beginning, which became, of course, a global player. And they are very successfully entering the Brazilian market. And exactly what both Jim and you and also Anna meant, that the easier, the best it is, so that it becomes accessible for the normal individuals to get in touch with the legal contents, not making life more complex, but the other way around, making lives easier for everybody. So I think, this could be definitely something to be shared with Juliana, who's a board member of Swedchem. And of course, I think we could have many more questions here, many more comments, but in my role, in my capacity as moderator, I always try to, keep kind of the same punctuality, both for starting and finishing. But I think, Anna, I will, of course, now give you the floor.
Don't forget to mention the standing neutral, because we talked about, Kate, remember, that is a very nice issue to bring to discussion. So this could be a good idea for another event. I'm always stressing Renato.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to share our research on the concept of a standing neutral and bringing kind of this mediation way up front and more preventive. Instead of it's like mediate or solve my problem, it's like let's prevent the problem and integrate them. And so again, integrating these concepts into the business. So happy to share on that in the future if you'd like.
And I like seeing Jonas smiling because you spoke about neutrality, and Sweden's very known for being neutral, right, Jonas? And thanks also for citing Nobel Prizes and citing the very well experience of Sweden the Nordics have had. I think it's great. But I mean, I think, folks, we had a very great discussion. I think this was according to the plan to have something like 1 hour discussion, interactions. I think there are, of course, other comments we could share later via mail with both our keynote speakers from abroad, right, Anna? Kate and Jim delivered fantastic, presentation set together with you, of course, Anna. And I would like to say, for us, SWEDCHEM, Legal Committee, Legal and Business Committee, but actually as well at the European Chamber, we are always trying to make, a very good and interactive approach in those kind of sessions we hold, right? So I would like very much to thank Anna for bringing the idea to invite both Kate and Jim. Of course, I would like to thank Viviane and Jonas for putting all the efforts to coordinate, to invite the people, to send, register everyone's presence here. And Jonas, I think I should give you back the floor as our managing director, well, to give the closing remarks. And well, thank you, everyone. And Jonas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Renato, and thank you so much, Anna, Kate, and Jim. Very interesting presentations. Not just a closing remark from my side, is about the long-term perspective. When you say that the Nordics have a high trust factor, I think the culture in the northern countries is thinking not for the next mandate or for this year's bonus. You think generations ahead, right? And then a contract, when you have a win-win setup, that has shown, it's proven in Sweden that it really works. When I came to Brazil, I'm not a lawyer, but I saw the contracts. They are so much longer than in Sweden and thicker. And people say, you Swedes are so blue-eyed, you're naive, But I think it's a working concept. It's again, Nordic countries, you have to work together. You have to trust your partners and suppliers. And it has been working. So I'm happy to hear that the research shows that the Nordic countries are at the forefront. So we are blue-eyed, but we are right? It's correct to trust your partners. So thank you so much. I'm happy that we have recorded this webinar. We will now promote it. And I would really much appreciate it if you can share the PowerPoints to Anna's and Kate's, so we can send that together with the link to all participants and those who had signed up for the event. So thank you again, and look forward to the next event. People in the Legal and Business Committee, hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.